Hi, and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how I built the Weekly Herald as an abandoned building. Now, I picked up these two kits at a train show, and the Weekly Herald and the Superior Bakery are based on the old Revell kits, which also came out as AHM, and were designed based on the scratch-built styrene structures from Alan Armitage, who wrote a number of articles about these and helped Revell develop these structure kits. In a previous video, I had already built the Superior Bakery, and in this case, I built it pretty much the way it was intended from the factory, only adding some 21st century touches in terms of weathering and a few little additions of my own. But for the Weekly Herald, I wanted to do something different. I had already been poring over photos I found online of abandoned buildings, and I wanted to try and capture the graffiti and vine-encrusted exteriors and the dank, smelly, mildewy interiors in something that I built. And this kit was going to be perfect for that. Now, this is what I had to work with. I was primarily just going to be using the walls and the roof and a few other parts. But just like my Superior Bakery, I ran into quite a few of the casting problems, such as excess flash because the dies were quite old. And there was one or two places where I think the dies may have been damaged over their 30 or 40 years of existence. For example, this front wall had this big blob that was not just flash, but it did have to be removed. So at first I got out my saw to see if I could cut it away, but that was taking too long. So I ended up getting out my Dremel tool, and I was able to remove it with that, and then I used my chisel blade to flatten it out. But this was more than just flash. After that, I glued the front wall pieces together, using a couple of pieces of strip wood to keep everything aligned while it was setting. And I also used some weights to align everything on the side wall while the glue was setting up. Then I started to glue my wall pieces together. First I put the back wall with one of the side walls, lining everything up. And then I glued the other side wall in place and let everything dry. Then I went ahead and glued the front wall in place after I had added the extensions onto the side. I also went ahead and added a few of these corner braces from City Classics just to make a stronger structure. And then I took it outside and coated the whole thing with a red primer. To get a little variation in the brick color, I also went over it with some light touches of Ammo Atom paint. And I thought I might fill in a couple of the windows as if they had been bricked over. So I got a sheet of my Monster Model Works brick and cut a couple pieces that would fit in the windows. And when I go to use them, I'd paint them a slightly different brick shade. Now it was time to start working with the actual windows. And after cutting them off the sprues and cleaning them up, I gave them all a red primer spray as well. This was going to be their base color. Then I used a sponge to dab on a couple different shades of gray. And once I was done with that, they came out looking like very convincing rusted window frames. Some of the damage that I wanted done was a skylight that was collapsing and falling in and had water leaking in. So I cut away part of the skylight in the roof, which took a fair bit of cutting, and then I glued it so that it was partially broken and gave it a coating of a gray chalky paint. Then I started putting some mortar into the outer brick walls. It was fairly difficult because of all the recesses, and it would build up in areas, but using some water and Q-tips, I was able to get most of it evened out. And these bricks were going to be pretty old, so a little bit of coating on them wouldn't matter. Then I painted the inside of the building a basic gray, and I came back and went over it with a black wash. and that gave it the kind of old, dirty interior look that I was going for. The next thing I did was cut a piece of foam core that was going to be my floor for the building, and then I went ahead and painted it a basic gray concrete color, and I added a couple small pieces of foam core to build a little ramp that would come down from the loading dock door. Now, I had some frosted acetate that I was using for the windows, and at first I just cut out a square where I wanted a window missing so you'd be able to look inside. But then I realized I needed a bunch of the windows broken. So I used a scalpel and started cutting my acetate into broken shapes and actually breaking a few of the window frames. And I started coming up with something that I liked a lot better. So I did a number of windows like that and started test fitting them into the building to see how they looked. Then I started looking at the doors and the loading dock and what I was going to use from them. I put together the loading dock and decided that I wanted one of the doors to be knocked down, so I had to cut it out of the door frame. Then I painted those pieces a kind of a faded gray-green, and I went ahead and painted the stone foundation of the building a dark gray. Now I started putting the window glass into the doors, and again I used a scalpel to make it look as if it was broken. And I finished up putting all of my broken glass into the doors. Then I cut out a piece of gator foam. This was going to be the base because I was going to do a diorama. I started working on the stone front, and the first thing I did was cover the whole thing with a thin gray shade, and then I came back and went over with a couple different shades of brown, again thinning them. Then I used a few chalky and parchment paints to paint all the different stones different colors. Using a wet palette, I was able to get quite a few different shades, and they also had a fair bit of texture on them because I was using terracotta and chalky paints. And then I put a dark wash over it. Now, my print shop was going to have an office in the front with the walls separating it from the back. So I used some scribed siding as the floor. Then I went ahead and stained it. I clamped it to a brace so it wouldn't warp while it was drying. Then I glued it onto my floor and I stained it a little bit. Then I went ahead and made a ramp that was leading up to the loading dock doors. Now, for building the wall between the offices and the factory portion, I just went ahead and started using strip wood, cutting it with my slicer, and stick built a wall the way you would anytime you're scratch building something. I made sure I had an opening for a door that led from the front offices into the back room. I do this kind of work on a silicone baking sheet because the glue doesn't stick to it. And this was what my wall ended up coming out looking like. Then I went ahead and painted the door and put some broken glass in it as well. Then I stained the wood to look like old 2x4s. One of the things I wanted was the cover for the electrical box on the outside to be open. So I made a separate cover and painted the inside of the electrical box dark black. I also wanted the windows on the front of the building to be covered with newspaper the way an abandoned building would be. So I made up a sheet that had a variety of newspapers on it and printed that out, and then just glued it inside the windows in the front of the building. And if you're going to have the inside open, you need to be able to see the newspapers on the inside as well, so I glued them there. Now I started playing with some of the graffiti decals I'd gotten. First, I made an interior wall that was going to go up against the loading dock, and I put a graffiti decal there. I also hand made a little bit of graffiti. I used watercolor pencils for this and did it throughout the interior. Now, for putting the graffiti decals on the interior walls, Some of them were on a white backing, but others weren't. So for those, I traced around the decal and then painted inside my tracing with white paint. And that way the white showed through on the graffiti decals. Then I started making my windows ready to put in by mixing up a very thin solution of burnt umber and putting it on the windows so that they looked very dirty. This would also highlight where they were broken. Then I covered my wall with a piece of material that looked like wallboard and punched some holes in it that looked like might be done by vandals, and put some graffiti on both sides of the wall as well, some of it being decals and some of it being hand-drawn. Then I went ahead and glued my wall in place inside the building. I was checking how you could see it from the outside. I wanted to make sure that I had windows in places where you could see inside and see the detail that was there. So I started laying out my windows where I wanted them to go in the building to make sure I had sight lines through the broken windows. Then I went ahead and glued them in place and started putting the doors in as well. And I also put in one of the pieces of Monster Model Works brick, but I only ended up covering over one of the windows. I also used some Monster Model Works brick piling for the chimney that would be coming up from the basement. And I added a couple of signs on the front of the building saying it was abandoned and that the property was for sale. I decided to name the building after the first printing company that I worked for, and I actually found a font that was very similar to what they were using back in the 60s and 70s. And I printed it out and rusted up the sign and put it in place. And it's quite reminiscent of the building while I was working there. Now, one of the things I noticed in some of the abandoned factory photos that I had was there's always piles of stuff in the corners. I don't know what it is, just debris covered in dust. So I cut a couple pieces out of foam, went ahead and covered them in a textured material, and put a bunch of dirt on them and just put them in the corners to represent what I had seen in the photos. I collected some interior details I was going to use, and I painted them using pan pastels and alcohol. And once I put them in place, I sprinkled a couple shades of artist pigments over the whole thing to again just look like dirt and dust. And I also had a leaking can of something. And this started to give me the decrepit interior look that I was after. I also used some more watercolor pencils to put some of the graffiti on the outside. Then I started laying out where I was going to put the building on my gator board for the diorama. After I did that, I masked off that area with tape and sprayed the whole thing with a stone texture. And after peeling up the tape, I had a footprint for the building to go in. I masked off around the skylights because I was going to spray paint them a black that I could then rust later. And I wanted to make sure they were covered in all directions. After that was dry, I came back with some putty and filled the holes where the sign that was supposed to go on the roof should be, because I wasn't going to be using it. Then I painted a few of the roof details, getting them ready to be put in place. I then glued down the sidewalk that was going to be in the front of the building after painting it. Now I was putting some of the graffiti decals on the exterior of the building after gluing it onto the base. This was another one of the ones where I traced around it and then painted the interior of the tracing white so that when the decal was put in place, it would have a white backing to it. And this method works pretty well, although it's a little more work. And you can see here the door hanging open on my electric box. And also I came back and rusted the metal steps leading up to the loading dock. I glued on the beam that was holding the crane that came out over the loading dock. And I planned to have the awning over the loading dock having collapsed, and the beam was what was holding it up. So I built it out of styrene U-channel, and I drew up a design that would look like something that was collapsed and started gluing the pieces together. I temporarily held it in place to see where the collapsed piece would be, and then I bent one of the pieces of U-channel and just started gluing the frame together, having some of the pieces having broken. And this was going to be supported only by the beam that was holding the crane. So once it was done, I went ahead and painted it a gray color, and then I came back and started rusting it. After gluing it in place, I started rusting some corrugated metal panels that I had. And I planned on gluing some of them in place and breaking some of them so that they looked like they had collapsed along with the awning. So I ended up gluing them in place either on the awning or on the ground underneath it. And it's pretty convincing that the beam is the only thing holding that awning from collapsing completely. I started working on the glass that was going to go in the skylights, and I cut out some of the panels and traced broken glass onto some of the others using a scalpel. And I went ahead and glued the one in place for the skylight that was still standing. Then I started cutting other pieces that were going to go into the skylight that was falling in. And I had to cut a lot more separate pieces for this and glue each one in using super glue. Then I made a mixture of thin gray and brown paint to put on the glass to make it look dirty. And I used some gloss Mod Podge to create a puddle underneath the broken skylight where rain was coming in. Now I started putting in some foliage using Martin Wellberg products, but as I was finishing one side, I realized that I hadn't done the weathering on the building and putting all the details on the ground that I had wanted to do. So I stopped putting the foliage in place and then started using artist pigments, which I like to use for weathering buildings. I started brushing the pigments on both the outside surfaces and on the inside. And of course the roof didn't get overlooked. Now I had a variety of detail items that I had wanted to put around the outside, again before I put in the landscaping, so I'm glad I remembered those. After cleaning them up, I went ahead and airbrushed them all with a gray primer. And then I started brush painting the individual pieces. The pallets were from Mine Mount Models, and I painted them to look like wood. And an old oil tank was from Best Products, and I rusted it up. And this auto chassis also came from Mine Mount Models, and I used a few different shades on it. And then the tires came from Best Products, and the cinder blocks from Interaction Hobbies. I also planned to put a couple of lamps over the doors, but the one for the back door I was going to show is the lamp having fallen off. But somehow the one over the side door was still hanging in there. Now I went back to applying more of the foliage, and it was even more fun now, so I could have it growing up through all the different detail pieces I put in place, such as the tires and the frame. And I ended up finishing putting all of the landscaping products all the way around. And I used some leaf material to start making vines growing up the back corners of the building. Now I planned on lighting this building, even though I know there's no electricity going to it. So I got this lighting kit from Evan Designs, and I had already put in some reflective tape on the inside. I used super glue to hold the battery holder in place, and then just soldered the wires together. And I was going to have two micro LEDs in place just to show some light inside the building if you were looking in through the windows. And it worked pretty well. I made the roof so it was removable, so I can take it off to turn the lights on and off when I want to. And this way I could tell that looking in the windows, you could see a fair bit of the interior in there. And I especially liked the way it looked with the outside lights off. So you're looking into this abandoned building. And while there shouldn't be any lighting inside it, the lighting does make it more interesting to see what the interior looks like, especially looking through from the skylights above. And I just had some finishing touches. I had the vines creeping all the way up to the top of the building on the back corners. And I had also added a street and some curbing to the front of the building, and then just finished all of the little detail touches around the outside. And at this point, my abandoned factory was pretty much finished. I was happy with the way it had come out, both inside and outside. And my goal had been to build the Weekly Herald a little different than it showed on the box top. And I was inspired by those pictures of abandoned factories. And having worked in a print shop that was somewhat similar to this, I knew what I was looking for as I was building it. And it gives you an opportunity to play with a lot of different textures, and there's a lot of creativity that I was able to bring into this, thinking about how I would make something look broken, how an effect that I might do would come out, and getting to play with how something that was built maybe 50 years ago might come out looking today after it had been abandoned. And that was really what I didn't want to have happen to this kit. Too many of these old kits go to train shows and get bought but never get built, and they just change hands until they're gone. I didn't want that to happen with this one. The only thing I still have left to do is I just received some taggers from Mini Prints. So once I paint them up, they'll go among the bushes spraying graffiti on my building. So these are my two ConCor kits based on the old Revell kits. And I hope you enjoyed seeing how I built them, and I want to thank you for watching.